Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to Living in the Solution with Dr. Elena George. Today I'm looking forward to our conversation with our next guest. He's been on the show before and he was a wealth of knowledge. I think today is one of those times that the conversation is going to be timely, lively, and I think people don't know what they don't know. So today we're going to be educating people about data. It's something that we, I think, take for granted. We put our information on all sorts of social media platforms and we put our thoughts and our emotions out there. But I don't think people think about how that's going to be used and how it's being used. And will it be used against them? I think we're seeing a lot of people found out, especially with what's happened in politics, of being labeled based on what they've put on their social media platforms. And I think it's time that we really understand exactly what that really means when we put our information out there. Today we're going to speak with Mr. James Gorrie. He has a wealth of knowledge and he's got a lot of hats. He's a filmmaker. He's an author of The China Crisis. He's worked and appeared on multiple platforms, including Zero Hedge, RealClear Politics, and The Epoch Times, where he's an authority on China, current affairs, and economic topics. He's been interviewed by various outlets, including NewsMax TV, City AM in London, RealClear Politics, MSN Money, and Seeking Alpha, to name a few. His educational background includes studies in international relations, comparative politics, specifically international political economy of Asia in the Asia-Pacific region in China. He has a BA in economics from the UC Santa Barbara, and his financial experience has included being a registered investment advisor and financial seminar speaker. So he can speak to a lot of topics that we're going to cover today, and I think you are a thoughtful person, and I love reading what you write on the bananarepublican.com, and people need to go to your website. And that's where I read your article called The Data-Driven New World Order is Here. And I thought it was extremely timely. So I wanted to get into that with you, and I wanted to welcome you to the show.
Well, thank you, Elena. It's a pleasure to be here again. Look forward to tackling this very big topic, and it's a very deep and encompassing subject. So it's very important.
I agree. I remember a few years back when I started writing my blogs, one of the things that started me thinking this path of big data was the health industry. And specifically, I remember it's coming around again, but it was in the past that Google was going to become a repository for your health data. And my thought was, what could go wrong with the most intimate parts of your history, your wellness, your doctor-patient relationship, being online. I never thought that was a good idea. And I did write about it, and thank God it went away. But it seems like it's coming back. So what is it about data that makes it so powerful? Is it more powerful than having money? Is it more powerful than oil? What makes it so enticing?
Well, you're right. Data is it's pervasively noted and collected, gathered, analyzed, categorized, and commoditized throughout our world. Whether it's as you say, in the medical area, the medical field, our phone calls, our browsing history, our consumer patterns, what we buy, what we look at, what we think about buying. So yeah, data is the new gold. It's what drives the global economy. Oil is no longer that top priority. It's still a huge priority, obviously, but data has been described as the new gold, as the new gold standard, the new oil that drives the economy. And it's more than just the economy, though, as you point out. It's whatever your political, cultural leanings might be. There's a way to capture it and to categorize you, and you just say label you and cancel you. So it's more than just knowledge. I mean, data itself is is information, but it's not information. It's contextualized. So, your neighbor is, think about it, your neighbor next door or across the street, they have an orange tree. Well, they like oranges, and you know where they live and what kind of car they drive. Well, that's okay. But nowadays, big tech knows their political affiliation, how much money they give, where they go to church or synagogue or mosque, or whether they don't, or what they buy, what food they buy, what alcohol they buy, how often they buy it, where they buy it, how you raise your kids. I mean, so many of us have these technological tools like Alexis and these other items. So yeah, data is being gathered at an unprecedented level, and it's not going backwards. It's going to get worse and worse. It's much worse than we actually realize.
It sounded so innocuous initially, prior to Facebook. I forget even what the name of the thing was before, when college kids were putting their information just so they could meet and greet. Is that how this started? I mean, or was this the plan to kind of introduce it innocuously, and then next thing you know, you can't live without it, or at least they hope you can't?
Well, I mean, data gathering has been around for a long time. You can go back to the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act of 1994 that required communication systems and companies to have wiretapping capabilities built into them to identify and intercept voice or data conversations between email, telephone, and internet addresses. So that's back in 1994 when the internet was, I don't think was really on the scene, perhaps emerging at that point. But back in the day when AT&T and transatlantic cables and telephone, it's pretty reasonably well known that the federal government said, look, we need to have you wiretap these individuals and eavesdrop on these people. So that's been around a long time. MySpace, I think, is what you're thinking about.
Exactly.
Prior to Facebook. Yeah. So yeah, here's the thing. I mean, the internet is a international or nationally and then internationally run kind of, for lack of a better word, network, platform, utility, whatever it might be. There's definitions that apply across the board there. There's no doubt that information gathering is really expanded and deepened in the past 25 years and even 10 years. And to your point about MySpace, back then, I'm of a vintage. I was born in the 60s, so your privacy was your privacy. People really didn't like to and weren't used to giving out a lot of information. If someone called you on your phone, it was a sales call, you got annoyed. But the generations now, the millennials and so forth, and younger, they don't know what privacy is, really. I mean, from a cultural standpoint, the whole paradigm has shifted, hasn't it? It just they were the digital natives. There's always been an internet. There's always been data. You've always expressed emotions and your feelings on Facebook or whatever the platform might be. So yeah, it's a whole new world, and that is not it's not a nice world. It's going to be there's a lot less to like about it than there is to like about it. I think China has kind of shown us the way there, right, in terms of social credit system. And if you say something, you read the wrong book, or you have the wrong conversation with the wrong person, somebody knows about it, and next thing you know, you can't buy a car. Your bank accounts are frozen. You can't get on a train to go to work, or you find yourself in a van being transported away from your house. So that is kind of the kind of a nefarious and malevolent direction that it can take. It certainly has taken that direction in China, and here today we have people canceled. Right? You say the wrong thing, you're canceled. You don't have a voice. Your voice in social media is taken from you. you are recategorized, certainly. You're ostracized and degraded online. So people can say all kinds of things about you, but if you're canceled, then you can't answer them back. And so there's a lot of, that's just the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot of aspects, meant to the data world, the data-driven new world, that are just horrendous.
Well, let's take our first break, and I'm going to explore that a little bit further, because you opened the door, and I think people need to understand what that really means. We just scratched the surface of what they're doing in China, and I never thought it would happen here, but I'm not so sure now. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with author James Gorrie. He's the author of The China Crisis, and his website is the bananarepublican.com. And we're speaking about a data-driven world. And you talked about consequences for putting not even you putting your business out in the street. I mean, this is not something that, it's so removed from the individual. How does anybody know that you're actually the person writing these things or going to these websites, but you're somehow tagged to this? And again, I remember back when they were doing the Intel chips and how they could tell your computer was, once you purchased it, they knew it was you based on some sort of chip in the Intel product. And we kind of ignored that like it was nothing. Is that how they're able to hone in on us? I mean, aside from what we put out there ourselves with our pictures and our life stories, is that something that they're able, from a physical digital standpoint, to tell who we are?
Well, there are many ways to do that. Your phone number, your IP address is unique. So there are lots of ways to identify kind of who that person is, unless you're a sophisticated cyber person who can mask that. Most people, by and large, can't do that. But what's happening besides that is you're being commoditized. We're all commodities, consumption commodities, political commodities. We're being identified and categorized. And in that sense, I think we're being dehumanized, right? So as you point out, someone can portray you or spoof you on the internet, as it were, and you have very little control over what happens and what gets out there about you. So there's a lot of danger. We're seeing that in cybersecurity all over the place. Cyber attackers will portray someone else online within a network of a company or organization, and then gain the trust of their coworkers and employees and so forth, and be able to exfiltrate data and steal secrets and all that, and extort money for ransomware or whatever it might be. So there's just a wide range of applications of portraying people, spoofing people, and not being able to control your own kind of person, your own kind of reputation. And that's so, data on the one hand is important. Medical data is very important, that if there's an accident or you need medical attention, that that you have, diabetes or insulin resistant or whatever it might be. And medical people need to know that, but there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for exploitation and dehumanization, really, of people outside of the medical realm, simply just in life. And to get back to the China thing, they're exporting their packages. They're called smart cities, and they're exporting. These are kits. These are packages of how to surveil and tag and bag and categorize and shut people up and keep an eye on people all the time. And these surveillance cities are making their way across Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa and other places. So it's certainly a trend. We don't hear about it much, but it's out there. So the economy definitely is not only data dependent, but I would say political movements and cultural movements are data dependent.
I was going to ask about that, and the connection between this data and driving the society socially. I mean, we're seeing so many politically correct, and you're not just taken off the internet, but I've seen evidence of people coming to people's homes and literally trying to physically intimidate them, to put it mildly. So this has jumped off of the digital page and it's become, real. So how much can you really, from the people who powers that be, do they really think that people are really going to continue to be that honest when they know there's a consequence for really sharing what they actually believe? So you're not really able, at some point, I would think, it's not going to be true what they're trying to gather about people.
Well, sure. I mean, if you have people self-censoring, I think is one of the consequences of that. People stop saying what they think. That's certainly the case in, again, places like China. They certainly don't say what they think. It's a good way to get yourself disappeared, after all. So yeah, there may be a disconnect between an individual's private thoughts and and their public or social media persona. We haven't come to that yet, I don't think, in large part, but I think it will come to that. But that may not even matter. In other words, if you can censor people, let's think about the vaccine for COVID-19. All right, it's very polarized. It's becoming more polarized. You can't go on Facebook and talk about the vaccine without being censored to some extent by Facebook or Twitter, and certainly medical doctors with tremendous credentials behind them and great reputations have been censored or been shut up. They can't talk about what they want to do on what they're talking about in terms of vaccines, in terms of alternative medicines for that and so forth, without being censored by Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so forth. So at the same time, not only are people being censored, but they're being shamed in the sense, right? If you question whether a vaccine is a good thing, especially this latest one, then you're anti-vax and you're given a label. It's almost like wearing some kind of badge of dishonor, as it were. You can be pro-polio vaccine and anti, or be skeptical of the current vaccines for COVID-19, and all of a sudden you're a retrograde, you're a bad person, selfish, endangering the rest of the country and the rest of society and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of polarization through controlling of the data. And let's just be honest, there's only a handful of people who control our entire social media. I mean, you've got Zuckerberg at Facebook and Jack Dorsey at Twitter and someone else at YouTube, or maybe YouTube's owned by Facebook or Google. And, there's tremendous amounts of information and evidence that, Google can sway through an election, 14 points, 15 points, percentage points, any which way it wants. And that was pointed out by a very left-wing Democratic scientist. Say, look, I'm worried about it because this can happen to anybody and to any election. And we need to have fair elections. So I don't really think it's censorship is a big deal, and people self-censoring is a big deal. But I think it's much more dangerous to our society, to our republic, that a handful of unelected people are controlling how, what information we get, and in large measure, and censoring the president of the United States. So if they can do that, imagine, their agenda seems to be, very, very one directional, and I don't think it's towards freedom of speech. I think it's towards dialogue.
Absolutely agree with you, and I love that train that pathway that you're taking, because they are the ones that are putting out this cloud that everybody's running here or there, but they're not really paying attention to the real problem, which is power concentrated in a very small pot, who stand to gain based on everybody hating each other. And not just us, but it's also the political class, because they think that they're going to get elected if they follow and keep these guys in power and don't pass laws that neuter them in some way. They're trying to get something from it too. But I mean, ultimately, does it mean that we need to disconnect from it? I mean, I understand that it's relatively powerful in terms of banking and all these other things, but if we were just to withdraw our consent, for example, from these social platforms, would that disempower them? Because we can't depend on the government to do it. I think that's over.
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that, although I suspect that given the past year or so, where online sales and online activity in terms of people buying food and clothing and just commerce skyrocketed, and I think 1 in 5 small businesses are now out of business. So it seems to me that there's to answer your question, I would answer it that way and say, well, there are fewer small businesses around, and habits have shifted toward more online purchases, online interaction. So can we disconnect? We could. It could happen, but I think it would have to be very coordinated and deliberate. People are starting to disconnect here and there on for their own individual reasons, which I think are probably good. Mm-hmm. But you get my point. I'm saying is that,
I do.
So much of the economy is data driven and digitally conducted. It would make it difficult to kind of step back as a whole and still be able to make a living for a lot of folks.
I'm an optimist, and I think this is the opportunity that we should take to take our power back. Have commerce with a local farm or local business. Stop using the internet to source your stuff. Source it locally and actually give jobs to your own community. They don't want that. And I think from what you described, and my personal feeling was that they stood to gain from this lockdown situation. Really, you're right. It was the only game in town. You had to have things brought to your house because you couldn't go out to shop because of various lockdown things that happen across the country. They made out like bandits in this situation. But I just don't think they need to continue to have that power over us. I think it's wrong on many levels, but it's about choice. And if you choose to do that, that's fine. But there's now a market, I think, if people think about it, of people who don't want to play this game and are happy to have commerce with people who are like-minded. That's an opportunity, don't you think?
Oh, no question about it. I think your key there is like-minded people, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If you go out and about, I still see people wearing masks in their cars, driving alone. But, people are masked, and not everybody, but there's a certain amount of fear. Mm-hmm. And without knowing everyone's personal health situation, you don't want to judge and say, oh, that person's being ridiculous, because they may well have a very good reason. So, but I think there's been a lot of fear driven into Americans.
No question.
Driven into the rest of the world. So like-minded people who don't want to be, who'll take their chances with that 1/8 of 1% chance of death from this disease. I think it'd be a great idea. I think it's a wonderful idea. I'd rather go shopping in the farmer's market and buying local and supporting local businesses anytime. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'm right there with you. I think it's a great idea. It will take like-minded people to communicate that over the internet, probably, or by phone or mail. But, yeah, I think it's probably happening, but I don't know to what extent.
Well, the way the data is being driven, it would be suppressed if it were happening, right? On that note, let's take our second break. You're living in the solution. Okay. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Mr. James Gorrie, and people need to go to his website, thebananarepublican.com. There's a wealth of information, including what he writes. And he also writes for the Epic Times, and you should do a search on things that he's written, because it's been a lot of various well thought out articles that'll make you think and also make you do your due diligence. And maybe that's another thing that we can bring out of this whole situation. not only becoming, having personal responsibility, but actually doing the work. Part of this data situation that I'm feeling is that people allow people to think for them. They don't do their research. The internet's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Either you can be suppressed and controlled, or you can go out there and actually start digging and do your own research instead of being fed pablum. Do you think that that's also, what's your thought on that, I guess?
Well, I certainly agree with that. They're making it more difficult if you have to go to places like DuckDuckGo to do your search. Things have a tendency of disappearing on places like Google and other search engines, right? They just disappear. You can't find them. So there is that. This isn't a benign development, whether it's Google, Facebook, or whomever. There are deliberate algorithms, deliberate decisions made to censor or prevent certain information from getting out. So that's ongoing. And that's not going to stop. I don't think it's even possible or likely, as you pointed out earlier in our discussion, that the federal government will break it up a la some kind of AT&T breakup, antitrust situation. There's too much money. They're too powerful. So I would agree with you, and people do have to do their due diligence. But again, if folks think about it this way, and I know you have, there's MSNBC people and there's Fox News people, and confirmation bias. I watch neither of them, but I used to, but I haven't watched them for years. But there's confirmation bias. Yeah. And if you speak with a medical doctor who gets their information from the Lancet or other places that are very mainstream, they're going to think one way.
True.
And if you speak to a medical doctor who's same education, Harvard, Chicago, wherever it might be, but they're just more advanced, or they think for themselves, and you're going to believe them. So it's a challenge, isn't it? Because we have different cultural, political ideas. It's really become polarized. So the age of fake news, which is deception, has that impact and has an effect. You don't know what to believe, or people on one side don't believe the people on the other side, and they don't want to interact with them per se, or any reasoned conversation or argument is precluded oftentimes by their own biases.
You make a very good point. I agree, and it's very limiting. I don't think we've ever, growing up for me, it was never about my way, or I was wanting to learn from people who didn't think the way I did. It wasn't, my way or the highway. And this confirmation bias is being, I think, ingrained because there's a supposed carrot if you follow it and a supposed stick if you don't. So there's this, well, I just rather just not even engage, or I'll just go along because it's easier. But does that actually push this further down the road because people are not up in arms and they're not being more resistant to things that they makes them feel bad? I stopped watching the news, like you said, a long time ago too, because I realized I felt bad after watching it. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. And as soon as I took it off the TV, stopped watching it, then I had a clear view to take a step back and really think about things and do my research. And again, I think it comes down to you wanting to do it yourself or having somebody do it for you because it's easy or because you feel good. It's like a hit. You get a dopamine rush because you're right all the time. It's just silly, isn't it?
It is silly, but you're absolutely right. It's very, very powerful. And it's very powerful. In my father's generation, I can remember him saying this. This is, 40 years ago, but 30, 40 years ago, he'd say, something along the lines of, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Exactly. That's over.
That's over.
Yeah.
Right. That is over. And you're absolutely correct. You're spot on. People get a rush for being morally superior. I use that term loosely, but it's a feeling of I'm doing good. I'm a good person and I'm right. And I've got I got affirmation. I'm affirmed that I'm right. And there's a certain moral kind of dopamine rush you get from that, right? And it's very difficult to have a conversation, certainly with a stranger. And, even with your friends, you have to agree to disagree. I don't like choosing people or having friends that just agree with me. That's boring. I mean, my wife and I don't even agree on everything. And that's probably why we're still together. A lot of fireworks. But, you don't say that. You have to get along with people, right? I mean, that's important for a society to function. And when you break into tribal divisions, which is what we're seeing, then it's very bifurcated. It's polarized, us versus them. And we're seeing that along these lines of whether it's the vaxxers or pro-vaxxers, anti-vaxxers, or conservative or liberal, or whatever it might be, right? There's all these different lines that are being drawn, and racial lines particularly as well. So it's not healthy. It doesn't make us better people. It doesn't make us smarter. It dumps us down. It dehumanizes all of us. And to what end? Well, it gives, as you pointed out in the beginning of this conversation, it sends power upward into the narrow few. And
they can
we're
keep
easily
it
manipulated.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I thought about I just lost my train of thought for a second, but this racial divide and this, not only am I a good moral person, but you're also the worst person in the world. So it's the same weird argument that seems to pervade the society, at least for the past year. For example, if I wear a mask, I'm protected, but you need to wear a mask too because, or I took the vaccine, so I'm protected, but it's never enough. So I can be a moral person, but you have to be devil incarnate and you need to be removed. It's not like I can coexist with you. You have to do it my way or you need to be gone. That's a whole different mindset. It's very aggressive, I'm finding, and there's no thought involved. And the interesting thing, when you do have a conversation overall and you ask somebody well, how'd you come up with this? Or what source are you using? That never enters these folks' mind. It's just emotion and no facts, no research, no, critical thinking going on. Is that also by design?
I think it is. It's a byproduct. It's a result of these things we talk about. Because I'll give you a perfect example. I was speaking with an acquaintance at a dinner party the other night, and I said, "Look, we were talking about the virus." And I said, "Well, it's pretty apparent that it's been synthesized in a lab." And his wife was in the medical community, and he says, "You don't know that." I said, "Because you're not a microbiologist." I said, "No, I'm not." I said, "But Dr. Luc Montagnier is. He's the Nobel Prize winning scientist who discovered the HIV virus. I said, Dr. Wang from Taiwan National University, he is. These other doctors from Holland and England and Germany and the U.S., they've all looked at it and said, but this is synthesized." So then you go, well, how does it happen? Well, gosh, I don't know all the details, but I will trust an expert's opinion if there's enough of them around. And by the way, a lot of them are being censored. So we couldn't get past the fact that he hadn't heard of them. And so there was no discussing the topic. It's not even possible. So he's a bright guy, intelligent guy, but it's our mentality of we have to be right. We are right. We know we're right. And you're wrong, as you point out. So, and it's interesting, as you mentioned about how we have to be the opposition is the devil incarnate.
Mm-hmm.
About 10 years ago, there was a guy named Keith Olbermann. He had a show on MSNBC, and he used to have a segment called The Worst Person in the World,
mm-hmm.
where he literally just demonized somebody on national TV. And that got old very quickly. But I thought, as you were saying that, I thought, my gosh, this guy was ahead of his time.
You're open the way for this,
Well, he did, and it's kind of it's an extension or maybe some part of identity politics. Hey, you're not a person; you're a white male. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? You're not a person; you're a black female, or you're an Asian yuppie, or whatever you might. People are being categorized in these political boxes, and that's all that matters. That's all they become.
But you know what's interesting? I'm sorry, I mean to cut you off, but you know what's interesting about that? Especially since we're living in the PC world of racism, everything's racism. That is the most racist thing that you can say to somebody. I mean, I'm just going to talk political events for a hot second. The AG, the Attorney General, is going to, I guess, sue Georgia because black people can't get photo ID. I mean, come on, man. I mean, everybody black in Georgia can't get an ID. They can't get on a plane. They can't go into a government building. And they're trying to sue based on a racist assumption with a straight face. And this is going on 24/7, no matter what group it is. I just shocked that people they're not offended by it. It's like, it's just totally offensive.
You should be offended by it. I mean, my gosh, it's such an idea. Can you imagine the notion? Turn that around. What if Donald Trump had said, black people aren't smart enough to get their identification? I mean,
oh my gosh,
there would be. So that's the problem. Is stupid statements are protected by whoever who happens to be issuing them, or they're attacked. And smart statements are attacked if they're issued by the wrong person, or the wrong political party, or whatever other categorization it might be,
or whatever the flavor they say it is that week, right? Because I mean, it's all about power. So bold and so said with such venom and authority that people, well, maybe they're right. Is that let's take a break and revisit that, because it's just, I don't get it, but it's pervasive and we're letting it go. And I don't think we should. So let's take our last break. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Mr. James Gorrie. He's the author of The China Crisis, and he writes for Zero Hedge and Epic Times. And before the break, we were talking about this wrong and strong mentality. How can we, I think it again plays on the decency and of people and their empathy. When are we going to stop saying it's okay to be called something just because of what you look like? Happens to be the white males this year. Who knows who it's going to be next? And for people to acquiesce and say, you don't know someone's heart. How can you tell them they're racist? It makes no sense, but people don't fight that. When are we going to see people, in your opinion, is this something that we're going to have to come organically to? Because it's not going to be the big tech that turns this corner for us.
No, it won't be big tech. Well, one of the forces, I think, will be religion, and in particular Christianity. And on the one hand, there's a lot of churches that are they're losing people, right? They're losing the congregation. And that may not be a bad thing, because people will leave churches for all kinds of reasons, not just because they've lost their faith, but maybe the church has lost its way. If it's all about race, skin color, then boy, that makes us a pretty stupid species, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. It makes us pretty dumb. It makes us pretty ridiculous. So we know that's not the case. But religion is one force, especially Christianity per se, is one force that will do that. Because look, in the Bible itself, it says we are all mankind is of one blood. You can't hate your brother and love the Lord. Mm-hmm. You're a liar. All right. So that something greater than ourselves that brings us together in the spirit that is imbued within us from God, then that is something that will take us a long way towards healing. Because what's also behind that, or what accompanies that, and what attaches to Christianity, is not just the notion of we're all brothers and sisters in God and the Lord, but we're also to what? To forgive. Now, the cancel culture is very unforgiving, isn't it?
Very much so.
very unforgiving. I don't care what color a person is. They're all human beings, and we need to recognize our humanity, regardless of whether we agree with how they live their lives, or at the same time, we can't turn our backs and say, "Oh, I can't criticize something if it's wrong." And again, what's our source of moral certainty? Well, mine is God, the Bible. Other people's is may not be that. Evidently, I'm seeing. I think is evident, but the other thing is that people take offense at everything. That changes freedom of speech. That's part of that notion that, well, if you disagree with something, you're a hater, you're a phobic, whatever it might be. And so you're automatically canceled and dehumanized, and you don't deserve to exist. Those are that's the general reaction you get.
Mm-hmm.
So our founding fathers way back when, they were a pretty rambunctious group of guys and gals, right? Aaron Burr and Hamilton had a duel, had a shootout. Hamilton died with that. I mean, these guys weren't little waistcoats and wigs. They were in waistcoats and wigs, but they were much more than that. They were very passionate guys, and very talented, very smart, and very frail and very human. Offensive speech in that day was against the King of England, or against the crown, among other things. And they said things about each other's wives, all that kind of stuff. But so the point is, nothing's really changed, right? We're still the same people we were then. Offensive speech has to be tolerated, but lies do not have to be tolerated. Slander doesn't have to be tolerated. But, once you start reducing speech because it offends someone, then you've lost your freedom of speech. And that's what's happening in freedom of expression is replacing freedom of speech. And freedom of expression says everyone has a right to express themselves, but you also have a right not to be offended.
That's mutually exclusive, isn't it? How does that work?
No, it doesn't. It kind of leads us to where we are in the society right now, right? You can't say things that are quote unquote offensive because you might offend somebody. You can offend me. I'm a white Christian male. I mean, you can offend me all day long, and you'll go far in life. But you can't offend. You can't defend, or you can't be a black conservative. You're an Uncle Tom, or called worse.
But how do we get out from underneath this? Because it's like one party superimposing their will on somebody else. But if you're not that, and you're not, is there a way to say, just, I don't care what you think, you withdraw your consent, by you acquiescing to them, gives them power in some way, at least in their mind. And the best argument to have is not to have one, no question. But do something else. I mean, take your child out of school if they're being taught to hate themselves. They come home depressed. They don't know if they're a boy or a girl. You name it. It's the parent's job, for example, to remove their child from that situation. And as an adult, or if you work for a corporation, or if you work with people who do that, either you stand up or you leave. But to continue to empower that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We've done that for the last, 5 years, 6 years, maybe longer. And where's it gotten us? It's gotten more censorship, more cancel culture. So it's obviously not working.
Well, it's working for the people who want it to work.
Well, that's true.
It's working for them.
It is. That's the problem.
It's working really well for them. People get fired. They lose their jobs. Or their kids get ostracized. Or worse. I think people are standing up. I'm seeing it in terms of school board meetings and so forth. But it's going to take some, the pendulum goes back and forth. We'll see how far this direction the pendulum swings. I'm hoping it's reached its point.
Yeah, me too.
I'm not convinced of that. But as I said earlier, I think from a like-minded people, whether it's conservatives, liberal, religious, a-religious, whatever it might be, that's where your community is in terms of support, in terms of making a difference. So I think it's very important that, from my perspective, it's my Christian faith and it's my belief. And, you got to forgive your fellow man and woman. And those two things are very powerful forces. And in China, the underground church is spreading like wildfire. You try to suppress it, guess what? It just goes underground and it goes everywhere. And Iran the same way. So I'm not here to proselytize per se, but there are forces that are available to us that people who want to be free, people who want to have freedom of expression and want to protect their rights. You don't have to be religious; you can be constitutionalist for that matter. So those are the things that need to happen, and you can see them on using the internet on Facebook. There are groups you can join, and at least for the moment, we'll see what next week brings. But you've got to be able to be a part of a community that you feel support and that you gather strength from and push off from there. But you're absolutely right. They lose their jobs, they lose their livelihoods. Their children get taught things they don't want them to be taught, and that happens everywhere. And it's not an easy. The whole thing about systemic racism is that's the argument. We have systemic anti-Americanism and anti-American values and so forth. That's what's systemic, really. From defund the police to critical race theory to a variety of these things that are transforming the country and the culture. And there's not a lot of pushback relatively at this point, because if you do push back, you get canceled in one form or another. So it's a challenge. It's a big deal.
It's a challenge. It's
Yeah.
definitely a challenge. And I think instead of us hyphenating ourselves and going into these groups, we really do need to step back to the beginning of our show, whereas these power concentrators these puppet masters are keeping us fighting each other on these ridiculous points, when in actuality, if I'm not free, you're not free. If I can't speak, it's coming down to you at some point where you're going to feel what I feel, So you should, and I hope that we'll get to the point where the people can live and let live instead of talking about it, actually do it. But I don't think they've yet experienced, they think there's still a special protected class at this point, that they can, have privileges by following along and getting along. And in actuality, what you're doing is just going further under a yoke and being further manipulated and controlled. And when you do figure out it may be too late before you can extract yourself.
Yeah, what was that? There was a German pastor, I think he was a pastor, said something along the lines of, when they came for the gypsies, I said nothing, I wasn't a gypsy. When they came for the homosexuals, I said nothing, I wasn't a homosexual. When they came for the Jew, I said nothing, I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one left to say anything.
That's a really important story, and it doesn't matter. We're human. It's as human versus whatever's going on outside of this right now. It doesn't matter color, where you're from, your accent, it's irrelevant, because we're all in the same position. You're not special, in other words. I know we have a few seconds left. How can people get your website, get your book?
Well, the book is sadly, it's out of print. I'm working on a new one. The website is thebananarepublican.com, and I have to confess, I've been negligent in adding new content. I've been working really hard. Quite frankly, it's a lot of work for one person to do. So I try to add things to it, but I'm a little behind the curve. I have to admit that.
You're human.
Forgive. I just got the rights back to my DVD, my movie, The Indian, and it'll be available on DVD at theindiandvd.com soon. So
awesome.
It's a great story about chock full of a broken family of good values and a father who has to find a way to make it up to his son who he left years and years earlier. So it's a good story. It's wonderful. And so they can read The Banana Republican on Epic Times as well. And I love being on your show. I hope you're doing great things here in terms of audience response and so forth. I hope it's appreciated, because it should be.
Well, it's a labor of love, and I think anything you put out there that's from the heart and to help people, then whoever it reaches, it's God's gift. and so are you. So I really appreciate what you do, and keep doing it. I'm looking forward to having you back on anytime.
My pleasure. Anytime. Happy to do it.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for living in the solution.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Liberty Talk FM.